The answer to the ideological vacuum at the centre of our societies and the problems that that causes, the fact that we don't have any vision in our society, that we don't have any source of unity in society, is causing the opposite of social cohesion, which is social disintegration, and that is the reason for such things as vandalism, rising crime rates, gang warfare, drugs, alcoholism. All of these things are phenomena that are the result of social disintegration because we don't have a common vision at the centre of society, because we have no vision of where our society is trying to go, what its values should be, or any of these things.
Hello and welcome to Baha'i on Air. I'm Bev Watson. Our program today is on the place of religion in modern society. To help us discuss this question, we have with us in the studio Dr. Moojan Momen, an Iranian-born Baha'i who now lives and works in the United Kingdom. Dr. Momen has written extensively about the world's great religions for both academic and non-academic audiences, a total of about 10 books in all. He has also written for encyclopedias and academic journals, and has lectured at Cambridge University, Oxford and London universities, at the Royal Asiatic Society in London, and at the Centre for the Study of World Religions in Beijing. Dr. Momen, welcome to Baha'i on Air. Thanks for joining us here today. Can we start off by asking you, how has the place of religion changed in our modern world?
Well, Bev, if you think about it, if we went back 200 or 300 years, the position of religion was at the very centre of society. Religion was centred. Religion was the centre in the sense that it was the focus of the society. It was the centre of values. It was the source of the vision of society, of where people were, what they were doing. Everything about the arts and literature was often a reflection of religion, and even things such as medicine and social welfare and so on were very much organised and influenced by religion. So religion was the focal point of society. And that situation continued, at least in Europe, until about the 18th century. And from that time onwards, gradually, this view of religion as the centre of society was pushed aside. And whereas previous to that time, the religious viewpoint was really the only viewpoint. So, for example, if you'd been living 300 or 400 years ago, you would have thought of yourself as being on an earth somewhere in the middle, and above you was a heaven and below you was a hell. After this process of religion being pushed aside, its place was taken by science, and you had a new viewpoint. You had a scientific viewpoint which started to investigate the natural world and create new ways of looking at the world.
So why was it that this actually happened? What brought it about?
People started investigating the natural world. People like Galileo and Copernicus looked through their telescopes and saw that the world wasn't the way that religion had portrayed it to be. And then during the course of the Enlightenment, people began to focus on the human mind and reason as a source of knowledge. And into the 19th century, one of the major blows against religion at that time was Darwin's theory of evolution and the effect that this had on religion's view of the origins of humanity and the place of humanity in the natural world. A number of ideologies came in to replace religion at the core of society. So these ideologies replaced religion in the sense that they formed a basis for the values of society. They provided a vision for society. And these ideologies were such things as nationalism, which came to the fore really in the early part of the 20th century, racism, which was very popular between the First and the Second World Wars, and then going on into the last half of the 20th century, socialism and communism became extremely widespread and popular. And these ideologies, as I say, tried to replace religion by forming the centre of society, being the focal point for the unity of society, giving society a source of values, a vision for where society was trying to go, and in the case of communism, even trying to replace religion as a controlling factor over the arts and literature and all other aspects of society.
These ideologies don't appear to be around anymore, do they? They don't seem to have worked as well as people might have hoped.
Yes, you can say really that the history of the 20th century involved the failing of these ideologies one after the other. And not only just that they failed to produce the benefits and what they promised, but they actually produced great human disasters and catastrophes. The whole of the First World War can be seen as the result of an excessive nationalism. And then the Second World War was really, to a large extent, caused by the racist ideologies of Nazism and fascism. And then after the Second World War, communism and socialism became extremely important, particularly among the colonies as they became independent. Many of them took on nationalism first and then socialism, and many of them communism as well. And these ideologies promised all sorts of things to these newly independent nations, but as we came towards the end of the 20th century, communism began to fail. It became evident that it wasn't going to produce the benefits that it promised, and so the situation we had at the end of the 20th century and now in the 21st century, looking forward into the future, is that all of these ideologies, one after another, have failed. And we have a vacuum again at the centre of society.
So is that where you see us at the moment, that we've fallen into some kind of a vacuum where people don't know what to turn to and hold on to?
There are a few things on offer to people. For example, free market capitalism is the rage in the economic sphere, but really that doesn't provide an ideology for society. The sort of individualism that this capitalism encourages is in fact the exact antithesis of society. It's the individualism that free market capitalism encourages, in fact, if anything, encourages the breakdown of society. You have such phenomena as, for example, vandalism, crime, drugs, gang warfare. All of these things are symptoms of social disintegration in a society that doesn't have a central ideology, a central vision, a focal point for unity. And human beings, being social animals by nature, need something to knit their societies together. And if you don't have something cohesive in the centre, you get these problems happening. And, for example, gang warfare can be thought of as human beings getting together and saying, well, if society as a whole is not going to provide us with a focal point for unity, we'll create our own units and our own sources of unity. If we had a strong religious influence in the centre of society, we would not have these problems. And so religious fundamentalism has become a very widespread movement, not just in the Islamic world where we tend to hear about it most, but you have fundamentalist movements in Christianity, in Judaism, in Hinduism and Buddhism. In all of these religions, it's a very attractive idea that somehow you can recreate the situation of 300 years ago when religion was at the centre of society and religion formed the values of society, and these values would, by their very nature, be against corruption and immorality and all the problems of modern society.
So is that going to work, turning the clock back?
Well, in my opinion, no, for several reasons. First of all, you can't turn the clock back. The situation 300 years ago was that the religious viewpoint was the only viewpoint on offer. There were no alternatives. Once you have a world in which you have alternative viewpoints, once you have a scientific viewpoint, for example, on the world, and you have all the products of science and technology, you can't turn the clock back to a situation where there is only one worldview and that worldview dominates everything. If you're going to have the science, if you're going to have the technology, and none of these fundamentalists are suggesting that we don't have the technology and the science, and once you introduce the scientific viewpoint with its questioning and its analysis and so forth, then that by itself tends to break down this very traditionalist and fundamentalist viewpoint. What these fundamentalist regimes try to do is to cocoon their societies from what they consider to be the evil influences of the modern world, and to shut out all of these influences and create societies that are shut off from the rest of the world. We are now living in what some people have termed a global village, or what the founder of the Baha'i faith said that the earth is but one country and mankind the citizens of that one country. We're no longer in the sort of world that you can form a secluded society that doesn't interact with the rest of the world, that isn't dependent on goods and services and other things coming in from the rest of the world. And so this whole fundamentalist project of trying to create such a society is, in my opinion, doomed to failure. The fact is that they haven't produced the goods. They haven't fulfilled their promises that they made to the people. They haven't created a society that's in which people are better off. They haven't created even societies where there is less corruption and less crime and less drugs. All of these problems are just as prevalent in these fundamentalist societies as they were before the fundamentalist regimes took over. So we have the evidence as well that they don't work, they don't produce the goods, they don't fulfill the promises that they make.
What does that leave us?
Well, I think what Baha'is would say in answer to that is that both visions are partly right. The fundamentalist vision that somehow religion should regain its position at the centre of society and act as the source of values for a society is correct, but that religion cannot be this sort of religion that turns its back on the modern world and tries to go back to the past. It has to be a religion that accepts the modern world on its own terms, accepts the fact that we are now living in one world, we're living in the position where everything is interdependent and interconnected. So it must be a religion with a global vision, a religion with a vision of a united humanity, a religion which sees science and religion as being two compatible forces in the human world that should work in harmony with each other, that promotes, for example, the advancement of the role of women in society. A religion, in other words, that is adapted to the modern world and has therefore a vision for the future of human society, a vision of moving forward towards a greater degree of unity in the world, the vision of uniting the various peoples of the world into one people. These sorts of forward-looking visions is what society needs. And Baha'is would say that the Baha'i faith is such a religion that looks forward, gives people a vision of what the future can be, gives them a source of values, gives them a focal point of unity, and at the same time preserves those elements of freedom that the liberalism and the capitalism also give.
I can just imagine some of the people in our audience saying that's the last thing that the world needs is another religion.
And I think the best way of answering this is to say that if we look at religion, if we look at any of the religions of the world in their early days, when the founder of the religion was alive in the world, or the early period of the religion, then all religions have in fact been a source of unity. The founders of the world's religions were people who sought to bring people together, to create peaceful societies, to create unity among people who were often at war with one another or in conflict with one another. So each religion has degenerated into divisions and being a source of conflict. And what Baha'is believe is that from time to time, once this has happened in the world, God sends in a fresh religious impulse, a fresh source of revelation into the world that again then recreates that unity, provides an impulse for unity and an impulse for taking humanity on to the next stage of its social development, which Baha'is believe will be the unity of the world.
When we look at all the hostility and the war and conflict that's taking place in our modern world, how do you see this being resolved?
Well, Baha'is believe that what must gradually emerge in the world is a consciousness of the oneness of humanity. And we believe that this is something that is happening already and will continue to develop in the world. We are already living in a world that has united in so many different ways, through travel, through communications, through the internet, in terms of finances, trade. In all of these ways, we are all interdependent, and we are all connected with one another. And so in many ways our world already is united. It's only in a small number of areas, such as politics and in the area of statesmanship, that this disunity continues. And so we believe that the process of the consciousness of the oneness of humanity will push this on.
So it seems to me that we really need to be moving along a lot faster than we are right now.
There are certain ethical and moral values that now need to come into being in order that human beings can come together and create a united world. And so therefore certain parts of our culture, those parts that are divisive, those parts that breed hatred of other groups, those parts that put certain sections of society down, such as, for example, those parts that discriminate against women, these things that cause division, these things that create inequalities, these are the things that must be overcome. And those are the negative aspects of culture that we must try to overcome and transcend.
How do you see us reconciling all the different values that we have out there in the world?
Well, I think a great deal of responsibility falls on religious leaders. Unfortunately, some religious leaders, by no means all religious leaders, but some of them have been a cause of divisiveness. They have been a cause of prejudices and hatreds and so on existing. And I think really it's the duty of those elements within each religious community who are moderate, who do look towards unity, who are willing to get along with other groups and to create unity. It's the responsibility of those religious leaders to come forward and to start claiming the centre ground in their religious community and to say, look, our religion really isn't a source of disunity, but the fundamentals of our religion, the core values of our religion, the example of the founder of our religion is one of creating tolerance and unity in society and creating love and harmony among peoples. And if they fail to do that, then they're going to lose the respect of people, they're going to see their congregations dwindle, and they're going to find themselves at odds with the general trend of society, which, as I say, is towards an acknowledgement of the unity of the human race and the need for different peoples of the world to come together.
If the religious leaders have this kind of responsibility, it sounds to me like they need to start talking to each other a lot more than perhaps they have done in the past.
Well, I think that already is happening. If you think about the situation, say 40 years ago or so, there was very little interreligious dialogue going on. Each religious community was more or less self-contained and spoke to itself, basically. But now, in the last 30 or 40 years, we've had an increasing level of interreligious dialogue. Religious leaders have started talking to each other, and religious leaders have begun to talk in terms of what religions have in common and started to explore these issues. There's a long way to go yet, but certainly there is movement in that direction.
You mentioned terrorism as being the result of injustice in the world. Do you see this as something that we're going to resolve, or is it going to get a lot worse before it gets better?
I think it really depends on how seriously the world takes this problem. I think as terrorism has got worse, people have started to think how they can tackle it. And I think eventually people are going to come to the conclusion that the only way of tackling terrorism is to remove the support that terrorism has among large populations. And the reason that terrorism has this support is because of this question of injustice and unfairness and so on that people perceive. As long as there are large numbers of people who perceive themselves as the victims of injustice and are seeing themselves as being poor when other people around them are rich, then these terrorists are going to have a large base of support, both financial support and in terms of people sheltering them and so on.
Do you have any idea what kind of a time frame we're talking about when we talk about eliminating injustice and terrorism and all these kinds of things from our world?
I can say what I would hope would happen, which is that as people see that other solutions are not working, in other words, that you can't overcome these problems by exerting a military solution. You can't overcome these problems by being, even the most powerful country in the world cannot by itself overcome these problems. I think once people realize that, and as the realization of that grows, then people will move towards setting up suitable institutions that will solve these problems on a worldwide basis. These problems are global in nature.
It sounds to me like you're talking about the need for international law and international institutions.
It's now more than 100 years ago that Baha'u'llah called for exactly this. What he said at that time was that there's a necessity for the rulers of the world to come together at some sort of international conference, and at this conference the agenda should be that they resolve all of their disputes in terms of boundary questions and so on, if necessary by arbitration. And then once the boundaries of the world have been fixed, the way forward then is for the countries of the world to all agree to guarantee these boundaries. And if we could achieve that sort of a situation, then the need for countries to be spending large amounts of their wealth on military expenditure would be reduced. At the present time, many of the poorest nations in the world are spending 20–30% of their national wealth on military expenditure. And if they could have the security, if they knew that their boundaries were secure and they didn't need all of this military expenditure, they would spend this money on education, health, infrastructure, and so on. These worldwide problems that we face in terms of pollution, in terms of global warming, in terms of the activities of multinational companies, all of these things are now global problems, and they need global institutions that can regulate them. We need some sort of world parliament or a legislature that will regulate these things on the worldwide level. We need an international court of justice that can arbitrate in international disputes. We need these sorts of international institutions more than we have at the moment. We have things like the United Nations and a international court of justice, but at the moment these institutions are not strong enough. They're not really independent. They are subject to manipulation by the stronger nations of the world, and so the weaker nations don't feel that they are truly international and just and impartial organs. Many people seem to think that in the picture that Orwell drew of 1984, that somehow international institutions will mean a suppression of the individual and will mean a loss of freedom. But in fact, human experience has been exactly the opposite, that as you get greater and greater degrees of unity, in fact the freedom of the individual increases. That is why Baha'is believe that we must go forward into this realm of world institutions and world government and world courts of justice and so on, so as to control the negative aspects of globalization, so as to control all of these threats to our future, such as global warming and pollution and other things. We cannot, in fact, continue in our present world order, because our present world order is really based on 19th century concepts of national sovereignty and on the illusion that nations can, in this present day, act independently of one another. And that is already a fiction. We are already in a situation where the nations of the world are so interdependent that they cannot act independently of one another. If one country, say, reduces its interest rates, all the other countries follow in a sort of domino-like effect. So we're already, this myth of national independence and national sovereignty is just that. It's a myth, it's an illusion, but it's having unfortunate effects by allowing things like multinational companies and so on, international crime, and these things to function on an international level, while we've got no international institutions to control them. And humanity as a whole needs to move forward to that stage of having international institutions if we're going to reassert some sort of control over these international threats to our future well-being.
Do you have any idea what kind of time frame we're talking about when we're eliminating injustice and terrorism and so on from the world?
Well, Baha'is believe that it's something that has to evolve at the level of the individual in the first place. In other words, that we must ourselves as individuals try to overcome our prejudices, try to see ourselves as citizens of the world, try to put the interests of humanity as a whole above the interests of our local groups and our own ethnic and national groups. So it must start at the level of the individual, and this involves a new consciousness within humanity. So this is where religion comes into the whole thing, because religion is the main impetus for that. It is what transforms people best. It's the most effective thing at producing a new level of consciousness in human beings. And we can go forward from this consciousness of the oneness of humanity into all sorts of other areas of development of human society, the advancement of the role of women, the improvement in education, and all of these things that are necessary prerequisites for arriving at a state of world peace. So this thing must both happen at the level of the individual and also at the level of government, with governments of the world coming together and agreeing, as I said before, this global peace treaty that will guarantee borders and have this collective concept of collective security and setting up of international institutions. So it's something that individuals must carry forward and create unity within their own limited groupings of family and society and the workplace and so on, and must also happen at the international level. And the more it happens at the individual level, the more there is this transformation of the individual, the more that will put pressure on the politicians and the governments of the world to create that unity at the world level. And so what Baha'is see is a dual process of progress at the level of the individual through the efforts of religion, and religion such as the Baha'i faith, moving that process forward at the level of the individual, and in that way then creating pressure for the changes that are necessary it is necessary to have happen at the international level.
Well, that seems like a sensible place to finish our discussion of the subject today. Thank you very much for being with us, Dr. Momen.
Thank you for asking me.
It's been very interesting. And thank you for watching Baha'i on Air. We've been talking about the place of religion in modern society. Hope to see you next time. I'm Bev Watson. Goodbye.
If you would like to know more about the Baha'i Faith, look at our website at www.baha'i.org.nz.